You're watching BrainStormAcres. I'm Henry.
And I'm Irene.
We live off-grid in northern Arizona on 43 acres of homestead in the high desert. We've lived here for 17 years. Yesterday I said next week, and what I actually meant was last month. It was actually our 17th anniversary of actually living on this property.
Right, we've owned it for another year besides that.
Yeah, we've owned it for 18 years. Actually, that's 18 years next week.
Right.
When you look at some of the people that we watch on YouTube who are homesteaders, there's a lot of different reasons why they start and why they change and whether they move or not. In the case of homesteading, they had a place in Connecticut. It was small. It was essentially a small gentleman farmer location, which was great. They learned a lot of things, gained a lot of skills.
In some cases the hard way.
You know, when you do this kind of work, you always learn it the hard way.
Yeah.
You may have learned it the hard way as a child because you saw something that didn't work when your parents were doing it or when you tried something, but it's always the hard way because growing things is never the same thing twice, or seldom.
Well, in their case, they didn't understand some of the animals they were growing. They didn't know about plant toxicity, and they wound up killing a whole stack of goats because they got into rhododendron plants, and rhododies are totally toxic to goats, but goats will eat them. So the whole concept that goats will not eat things that are toxic to them is patently wrong. I know multiple people who've lost goats because of rhododendrons. Oh, lily of the valley, totally toxic.
So let's talk about Homesteading's new place. They bought around 40 acres, I think, that's on the top of a hill and has some downstream land, but it is bare naked.
Right, it's basically, they was completely logged off. I mean hard logged, not just the big trees or not just the whatever. It was skinned. It was skinned to the point where they have erosion problems on the top of the hill. That you could see where the water had run down and made, you know, runoff and all that kind of stuff. I'm sort of surprised the person who did it didn't get in trouble, because in most places in New England and slightly farther south, there are rules about erosion, and because that dirt's going to go somewhere.
It always goes downstream, and where downstream is depends on a lot of things.
Right.
Now, if you think about Cog Hill Farms, they went onto 40 acres, more or less, that was no longer developed. It had a pig barn on it at one point, and there had been a trailer on it, which was nice enough to have some kind of infrastructure.
Right.
But it was essentially next thing to raw land.
Well,
now,
actually, but it had been pasture at one time, so they didn't have to cut down trees. They didn't have major erosion problems on the majority of it.
correct.
I mean, it had started to go back to trees. The pasture was rough, but it was still mowable. It's not like in New England, if you had let pasture go for that long, it would have gone back to hardwood.
Now, the thing about going on to long disused land or land that's been disused for some amount of time is you're going to have some cleanup. And in the case of Jason and his wife, she is a tractor maven.
Yeah, she loves to run her tractors. And they have good quality. In fact, they just brought a new one. Was it last year, I think? They bought a bigger one that was new. So she had a small one, and they realized that when they moved to the bigger property, she was going to need a larger tractor. Otherwise, you're going to beat yourself to death, and you're going to wear your tractor out.
You know, the thing about raw land or reclaiming land and your equipment is you can trade time for money.
Yeah.
Your time for the money you don't have, or the money that you have for the time you don't have, or sometimes you don't have either of
And then you're really up the creek.
So, you know, they have a bush hog for that tractor attachment, and it does a great job, and that's a big deal. I can tell you from personal experience here on our place that not having the right size equipment is a problem.
Mm-hmm. And part of it's, one of the things we've always mentioned to people is, if all you've ever driven is a, you know, Honda Accord or something like that, and you're going to move out to the country, you need to learn to use standard. Now, I don't like driving standard, I'll be the first one to say that, but I am capable of doing it in a pinch. You need to learn to ride, just not just to drive equipment. You know, if you are the kind of person who can't safely run a lawnmower, I highly recommend, unless you are wealthy enough to be able to hire people to do everything on the planet for you, don't move out to the country, because you're going to have to pay someone else to do it for you, because the work has to be done.
It's going to get done one way or another, or you're going to end up being very, very unhappy.
Right.
Now,
because
Irene learned to drive the standard, I think the first year, second year we were married.
Yeah, because I was working for the Department of Interior as a seasonal employee, and I had to drive a standard pickup truck.
I borrowed a pickup truck from Walter, our landlord, and we went out to
The dump.
the desert.
Yes.
It was the old dump.
It was the old dump. The roads out there near the old dump were totally, I mean, they were okay roads, but they were empty.
And there was nothing to run into.
There was nothing to run into.
So it was start up and go forward 50 feet, stop, back up and go 50 feet. And I've taught a lot of people to drive standard using that technique. A lot of people get frustrated because they say, well, I want to shift, I want to shift. And I say, if you can start and stop and back up and steer going forwards, shifting gears is not a big deal. That will come.
Right.
So it's a matter of figuring out what you need for tools now and equipment. When you move out to the country, you're going to end up operating some bigger equipment. And with bigger equipment comes new skills and new safety precautions, because some of that equipment can kill you.
Oh yeah, big time. I mean, we used to watch somebody in Michigan who rolled a tractor over on himself. His wife came to check on him, and he was dead under the tractor. It can happen if you don't have a roll cage or a roll bar on your tractor. And if you've got one, you've got to be wearing your seatbelt, otherwise it won't do you any good. I never did heavy equipment operation as a kid or as a young adult. I learned to drive a forklift when I worked in a warehouse, when I was a manager of a chai tea company in California. Henry taught me how to use the forklift. And man, I became one heck of a whiz on that.
She's really good at it.
And part of the problem that people deal with is it's not like driving a car. When you're dealing with anything that you're lifting up and down, you have to deal with 3 dimensions. And that was one thing I had somehow, I don't know, it just came to me naturally in college. I used to play a lot of computer games. He worked in the computer center as a help person with the students, and I got to play in the back as long as I sat there with the lights off on the mainframe computer.
Had to be quiet.
Yeah, had to be quiet. I could sit in the back room in the dark and play computer games. Well, the navigation on those computer games was what they call XYZ axis. It's a 3-dimensionality. And I discovered I had a real knack for it. That actually came in handy when it came time to run equipment, because I knew what I needed to do. And even my old boss at the chai company said, wow, I couldn't do some of the things you do with that forklift. So while I never had driven a tractor, I had driven a forklift, which has a lot of the same requirements. So while I don't pretend to be a whiz at it, I can make do.
Well, let's talk about homesteaders who succeed through perseverance. There's a channel that we've watched. They're no longer really publishing content. That's Pure Living for Life.
And see, Henry would call this perseverance. I would call it a combination of perseverance and lies.
Well, we'll talk about lies in a minute. But, you know, that was a couple that started off without a lot of practical hands-on skills.
I think he could drive a standard. I think she could drive a standard. But beyond that, They weren't big equipment people. They weren't big tool people. I was never allowed to use anything but hand tools as a kid. But I knew how to use a saw and a hammer and screwdrivers and things like that. My father had a table saw. I was allowed to watch.
Yeah, the same thing for me. My father had a really nice table saw. My mother still has it in the basement. But I could watch, but I don't recall ever being able to use it. I might have been able to use it once or twice with my father supervising, but it was not something, because really those early, that table saw is probably now at least 70 years old.
They didn't have guards or anything on them the way the modern ones do.
They're a lot more dangerous.
Right, and the two of us taught one another, read the instructions, was careful, all that sort of stuff. And when I got my shopsmith for my wedding anniversary present, that was hysterical. I was thrilled. I wanted it. That's what I wanted. And it was funny because when the next time we moved, some of the guys like, "Oh, it's a really nice, saw you got there, mister." And he goes, "Oh no, that's my wife's." And but when I got that piece of equipment, I took the class that was available for it. Just
Many
because
classes, actually.
It was a series of classes because it was all the nooks and crannies of that particular equipment, which has like 9 million attachments. So we didn't just learn to use the table saw. We learned to use the bandsaw. We learned how to build jigs for a bandsaw. We learned to turn wood. All that sort of stuff. And so it was all of the aspects of that piece of equipment because it's a multi-tool. It doesn't just cut wood.
So Irene gained experience with joiners, planers, bandsaws, turning,
So that's a lathe, yeah.
table saw, all those basic skills for furniture making. So a lot of that was applicable directly to larger
you
scale
actually
building.
chose a project, and in my case it was a little table. You turned this and you cut that, and so you built the whole table by the time you were done.
So in the case of Pure Living for Life, they did a couple of smart things. One was they knew that they wanted and needed to mill their own wood for the beams for a timber frame house.
And this is a part of the world, because they were in Idaho, I think?
They're in Idaho.
These are real trees. We're not talking some scrubby piece of pinon like we have here. We're talking 40, 50 feet tall trees that have real diameter on them. If you don't have enough on your own property, which they mostly did.
Well, they didn't have that.
You could buy logs.
Right.
Yeah, you could buy logs from somebody else.
They bought a couple of loads of logs.
Yes.
Which meant that he could make mistakes milling. But a lot of these things, if you pay attention to the instructions, you talk to somebody who actually operates the equipment.
Best is if you can watch somebody operate
and
it.
get some pointers and some experience that way, you can muddle through. It may take you a lot longer than it would take somebody who's skilled, but you can get through.
Now, well, it's kind of like any of the skills that we have. Some of the art skills that I have. People will say to me, "Oh, that's a really cool bead you made there. How long did that take to make?" And I say, 15 minutes and 20 years.
Well, 30 years now.
30 years now, yeah. 15 minutes and 30 years. And most people get it right away. It's not just how long it physically took me, it's the fact that I've been doing it for 30 years. So I've got the techniques and the tricks, and I know if something goes wrong, I know how to salvage it. I know when it's not worth salvaging, and that's just as important.
Now, there's a tie-in between Irene and Pure Living for Life that was not obvious at first. And that is Pure Living for Life got Shelter Institute from Maine to come to their property and run a class to do all the joinery and erect their timber frame. Irene took
their home builder class
a while ago.
A long time ago.
Let's just say, again, another 30 years.
It was when the father who is now the grandfather, was running the entire company, and his kids were kids. And now his kids run it. And their grandkids are starting to work in it.
Timber frame is not something that's really difficult, but there are some real tricks. One of which is you really need to be putting the timber frame together when it's green. But you don't want it to dry out really fast, so you need to paint the ends of the logs so they don't crack and split. They're going to split anyway.
Right.
But
you want to control behavior.
But having the experts, and more importantly, the crane that was necessary to lift the bents in place was really key. Well, one of the things that you don't think about was that, yes, these two people built this timber frame, but there were 4 people from Shelter Institute, and there were
I think it was more than 4, actually.
4 from Shelter Institute, and about 10 people who came to take the class.
Right, at least like 10 or 12 people for the class, and they were all hands-on people from all over the United States, and I think 1 from Japan.
1 from Japan.
Yeah, and they had all the equipment. They made them do a lot of hand work, because as a small person trying to do your own building, it's expensive to buy some of the equipment. Sometimes in some parts of the United States you can get it used, but then you may have to refurbish it, which is another can of worms.
Well, it's another set of skills and more time and more effort and more money.
So, you know, I can buy for probably $200 or $300 all the basic equipment I would need in terms of tools that are hand tools to do post and beam.
It might be double that today.
Probably is. But, you know, say $500. I can buy all the hand tools that I would need to do it. The minute I add power tools, a single power tool might be $500 or $1,000.
Or more. A chainsaw mortising tool, it even used is about $1,500.
Right.
So, time or money.
Right.
You can do it by hand or you can do it by machine. If you can do it by machine, you have to have the money.
We watch people all the time who are trying hard but have like 0 skills. And honestly, you couldn't pay me to go into some of those houses. You really couldn't.
And it actually makes me feel bad because the people are trying really hard.
Yes.
And they don't necessarily know any better. I've been watching one couple for a bunch of years building an alternative building technique. And unfortunately, he doesn't have any engineering skills. And worst, if you're going to be a homesteader, you have to be prepared to listen to people who know more than you do.
There's the additional problem of trying to decide who knows more than you do. I mean, sometimes we get suggestions that are like, where the heck did that come from? And one of the homesteaders we were listening to the other day was talking, it was Homesteading's wife, Kay, was talking about the fact that she does not flourish in a critical environment.
They're getting criticism, but I'll tell you one thing. If you're going to do something on YouTube or do something in public...
Get used to it. People will say the rudest things to you. When we comment on somebody's post, we either give solid information, like somebody will say, we can't do this because of that. It has to be 120 volts, and we don't have a 120-volt system. And Henry will post, oh, gee, a 12-volt system version is available, blah, 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 you know, because sometimes you just don't know. And we've had people do that for us all the time, too. And it's awesome because there's this brains collection out there that is way greater than we could ever have ourselves, despite Google and all the other Bing and everything else, all the other search engines. So it is helpful. Sometimes something that sounds harebrained will actually be the right answer.
You know, at the end of the day, no matter how much time you spend studying, no matter how much experience you have, somebody else always has some other information that you don't have.
Right.
Some skill you don't know about.
Right.
Some approach to a problem that you hadn't thought about. No matter who you are, no matter how bright you are, no matter how old you are, no matter how young you are, somebody is going to have some information that is, wow, that's the way to solve this problem that I didn't know I had, but now I know it, and now I know how to solve it.
Right. Many of the greatest scientific discoveries in the last 20 years have occurred because 2 people from 2 different disciplines are chatting about something, and somebody knows something that somebody else doesn't know, and vice versa, and they collaborate, and that's where the breakthrough comes, because it's kind of like people will say, well, I was studying this, and nobody told me that I couldn't do that, so I did it. And people went, you can't do that, and they're going, I did it. And that's where the breakthroughs come through, and that's the way it is in a homesteading environment. We called ourselves BrainStormAcres because we are constantly brainstorming.